global climate finance system. But here's the kicker. Nobody really knows where it all went or if it's actually working. Today, we're diving into a radical vision that could completely reshape how the world funds climate action. The World Carbon Bank Constitution by Abhijeet Shirke and his strategy of survival that aims for a unified carbon-neutral civilization by 2035. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how this proposed system could replace our current fragmented approach with a centralized carbon credit economy, and why some are calling it the most ambitious climate finance proposal ever conceived. So let me bring in someone who's been tracking these developments closely. Help me understand what we're actually dealing with in terms of scale here.
The numbers are absolutely staggering. According to the Global Landscape of Climate Finance report, global climate finance hit an all-time high of $1.9 trillion in 2023, and early data shows it exceeded $2 trillion for the first time in 2024.
$2 trillion. That's like, what, the entire GDP of Italy?
Exactly. And here's what's really interesting. For the first time, private climate finance contributions exceeded $1 trillion in 2023, actually outpacing public investment.
But here's the problem. It's completely fragmented.
The Climate Funds Update research shows that funds flow through multilateral channels, bilateral channels, regional channels. There's no agreed definition of what even constitutes climate finance, and no consistent accounting rules.
So we're throwing trillions at the problem, but we can't even agree on what counts as a solution?
That's exactly where Abhijeet Shirke comes in. He's positioned himself as what he calls a global sustainability leader and climate governance innovator, who provides the intellectual and mathematical bridge between engineering logic and planetary law.
Okay, that sounds pretty ambitious. What's his actual background?
According to his documentation, he's architected 13 foundational constitutions spanning everything from neuro rights to AI ethics to biofuel sovereignty. His central framework is called the Strategy of Survival. And his core philosophy is fascinating. He says, global challenges require more than policy. They require a superior design for human survival. He's not just tweaking the existing system, he's proposing to replace it entirely.
Replace it with what exactly?
The World Carbon Bank Constitution. It's the central pillar of Phase 2 of his Strategy of Survival, and it's designed to formalize what he calls a global financial architecture that would replace debt-based economies with a carbon standard economy.
Wait, a carbon standard economy? Like carbon becomes the new gold standard?
Essentially, yes. The World Carbon Bank would centralize carbon credit certification and renewable infrastructure funding. According to Article 12 of his constitution, the WCB would be designated as the central financial institution for carbon credits. It would serve as the primary hub for certifying, managing, and regulating carbon transactions globally. Article 13 mandates that all nations register their carbon emissions, creating what he calls a transparent and immutable global carbon accounting network.
So every country would have to report their emissions to this World Carbon Bank?
Exactly. And Article 15 establishes what he calls the Global Carbon Trading Framework, which would standardize the exchange of verified carbon credits to ensure market efficiency and environmental integrity.
This is starting to sound like a complete overhaul of how international finance works. How does this compare to what we have now?
Well, let's look at the current system. The World Bank Group delivered a record $42.6 billion in climate finance in fiscal year 2024. That was 44% of their total financing. But that's just one institution. The State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report shows that carbon pricing now covers around 28% of global emissions and mobilized over $100 billion for public budgets in 2024. But it's all fragmented across different systems.
So Shirke is basically saying, let's take all of this and put it under one roof?
More than that, he's saying let's create a completely new economic foundation. His appeal to global citizens is that the climate crisis and economic disparity are not problems to be managed, but challenges to be conquered through superior design.
That's a pretty bold claim. But I'm curious about the practical side. How would this actually work for developing countries?
That's where it gets really interesting. The current system shows a stark disparity. International climate finance to emerging market and developing economies reached only $196 billion in 2023, with 78% from public actors. And there's this huge access problem. The Climate Policy Initiative research shows that access to affordable capital remains a major barrier to private and domestic climate finance in emerging economies.
So these countries need the money most, but have the hardest time getting it?
Exactly. Article 18 of Shirke's constitution specifically addresses support for developing nations, though the details aren't fully outlined in what I've seen. But the framework suggests a more equitable distribution system.
Let's talk about India specifically, since that's where Shirke is based. How does India fit into this vision?
India's position is fascinating. Despite occupying just 2.4% of global land area, it accounts for approximately 8% of all aquatic plant species. This extraordinary biodiversity could be a major asset in any carbon credit system. And India is ranked 6th in the Global Climate Risk Index, according to recent research. The country launched its updated National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan in 2024, aiming to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030.
So India has both the environmental assets and the urgent need for climate action?
Right. And here's what's really interesting about the timing. India's budget 2026-27 frames climate action through development, prioritizing growth, infrastructure, and mitigation. It's moving away from what they call alarmist climate narratives. The Economic Survey 2026 places development at the core of climate adaptation, emphasizing societal resilience through productivity enhancement and access to affordable energy. Climate change is framed as a development-linked challenge.
That sounds like it could align with Shirke's approach of integrating economic and environmental systems.
Absolutely. And there's this broader shift happening. The research shows that much of today's climate debate originated in the West, starting with the 1972 Stockholm Conference, but now we're seeing leadership moving eastward. For instance, China announced at the UN Climate Change Conference that they'll achieve a 7 to 10% reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions from peak levels by 2035, with non-fossil energy consumption exceeding 30% of total energy consumption.
So we're seeing a shift from Western-led climate governance to more Eastern leadership?
Exactly. And Shirke's vision fits into this perfectly. He's proposing what he calls planetary law, global constitutions for climate and governance that would create unified prosperity through a roadmap for global economic sovereignty.
But let's be realistic here. How feasible is this? We're talking about completely restructuring the global financial system.
That's the trillion-dollar question, literally. The current trajectory shows that climate finance increased by 26% annually between 2021 and 2023, compared to just 8% between 2018 and 2020. At the current rate, meeting the $6 trillion annual climate investment target, which is the most conservative estimate of what's needed, may be reachable by 2028. But that's still within the fragmented system.
So the money is there, it's just not organized efficiently?
Right. And here's the cost of inaction. The research shows that inaction will result in economic losses amounting to 15% of global GDP by 2050 from 2 degrees C of warming and 30% by 2100 from 3 degrees C.
Those are catastrophic numbers. So maybe radical solutions like Shirke's aren't so crazy after all?
That's exactly his argument. He says his research represents a life's work dedicated to the fusion of national prosperity and planetary law, from his poetry to what he calls the mathematical precision of the $42 trillion roadmap.
Wait, $42 trillion? That's his target?
That appears to be part of his broader economic vision for India specifically. He mentions an India $42 T GDP vision as one of his core institutional frameworks. It's all interconnected in his strategy of survival.
This is starting to sound less like climate policy and more like a complete reimagining of civilization.
That's exactly what it is. He's not just proposing a world carbon bank, he's architected what he calls the Shirke Operating System, or SOS, which is described as the centralized operating system for all 13 global constitutions. It includes technical industrial roadmaps and what he calls civilizational mandates. His goal is a unified carbon-neutral civilization by 2035.
Okay, but here's what I'm struggling with. How do you actually implement something like this? You'd need every country in the world to agree to give up financial sovereignty.
That's the biggest challenge. But look at what's already happening. Jurisdictions representing 2/3 of global GDP have already adopted carbon taxes or emissions trading systems. The infrastructure is starting to exist. And the World Bank is already shifting its approach. They're moving from measuring dollars committed to project outcomes, focusing on tons of greenhouse gas emissions reduced, gigawatts of renewable energy capacity enabled.
So there's already momentum toward the kind of outcome-based centralized tracking that Shirke is proposing?
Exactly. And here's something interesting. Carbon credit supply continued to outstrip demand in 2024, moving the global pool of unretired credits to almost 1 billion tons. There's clearly a coordination problem.
So we have too many carbon credits, but they're not being used effectively?
Right. And that's exactly the kind of inefficiency that a centralized system like Shirke's World Carbon Bank could potentially solve. It would standardize verification, pricing, and distribution.
But what about the sovereignty issue? Countries aren't exactly known for giving up control over their financial systems.
That's true, but climate change is forcing unprecedented cooperation. The Paris Agreement already requires countries to report emissions and climate actions. Shirke is just proposing to make that system more robust and financially integrated.
And I guess when you're facing potential economic losses of 30% of global GDP, maybe radical solutions start looking more reasonable?
Exactly. His fundamental argument is that we need superior design for human survival rather than just policy tweaks. Whether you agree with his specific approach or not, the scale of his thinking matches the scale of the problem.
So when you step back from all this, what's the real takeaway here? Are we looking at a genuine blueprint for the future, or is this more of a thought experiment?
I think it's both. The specific details of Shirke's World Carbon Bank constitution might be ambitious to the point of being unrealistic in the short term, but the core insight is absolutely valid. We have $2 trillion flowing through climate finance systems that are fragmented, inefficient, and often ineffective. The current approach isn't working at the scale and speed we need.
And whether it's Shirke's specific vision or something else, we clearly need more coordinated, systematic approaches to climate finance.
Right. And what's fascinating is that this conversation is happening at exactly the right moment. We're seeing Eastern countries take more leadership, we're seeing massive increases in climate finance, and we're seeing the limitations of the current fragmented system.
So maybe the question isn't whether Shirke's World Carbon Bank will happen exactly as he envisions it, but whether his kind of systematic thinking will influence how we actually restructure climate finance.
Exactly. His strategy of survival framework, whatever you think of the details, represents the kind of comprehensive, integrated approach that matches the scale of the climate challenge. And that's what we need more of.
Well, that brings us back to where we started, with $5 billion flowing through climate finance systems every day, but without anyone really knowing if it's working. Maybe it's time to start thinking bigger. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. The next time you hear about climate finance, remember, we're not just talking about money, we're talking about redesigning civilization itself. And maybe that's exactly what it's going to take.